have cell communication. They need to be able to coordinate everything through development, all the chemical reactions that are happening within the organism. And then unicellular organisms coordinate as well. They talk to one another as well. That's what you can see down here at the bottom. The example of these yeast cells speaking to one another. Okay? These yeast cells release mating factors. Remember, yeast is a type of fungus, and fungus does sexual reproduction. So these various cells release these types of mating factors, and the cells have receptors for the various mating factors. And so when those receptors are triggered, it starts the cascade pathway for reproduction, for meiosis to occur and reproduction to occur. So we're going to be looking at the different ways that cells can communicate with one another, and then how once the cell receives that signal, it can now do something about it. So first we'll talk about what's called paracrine signaling. Okay? Paracrine signaling is also called local communication. Okay? So this would be cells that are right there next to one another. So the cell that is going to secrete something, so in here we've got our large secreting cell in the middle. It's secreting these various signals, and that cell secretion is going to impact target cells that are very close by. Okay? Maybe directly touching cells. If they're not directly touching, they're in very, very close contact with one another. Okay? So nearby cells is going to be our local or our paracrine signaling. These could be growth factors. These could be neurotransmitters. Like I said, it could also be direct contact. So let's look at a few pictures of those. So let's look at the two examples we have here. These are both examples of local or paracrine signaling. Okay, so our cell-to-cell contact, remember the plasmodesmata in the plant cells, the gap junction, the animal cells, that's definitely local communication. Okay, those cells are touching one another, they're in direct contact. These would be, you would see this some in embryonic development. You would see this okay, there we go. In embryonic development, as well as the immune system. The immune system, you see a lot of this cell-to-cell recognition. Okay, we'll talk about the immune system soon. But you'll see a lot of this cell-to-cell recognition, like antigen-presenting cells, things like that where one cell has to be able to recognize another cell. Okay. This other example that we have here, okay, down here we've got a neuromuscular junction. So the yellow part here, okay, that's our neuron. And the neuron is releasing all these little green dots. Those green dots are our neurotransmitters. Okay? And so those neurotransmitters, that's a local communication. They're just going across the synaptic cleft here to signal the muscle cell, so to cause the muscle cell to contract. So all of those would be examples of local communication. Okay? We're going to focus a little bit more on our long-distance signaling, okay, and our use of hormones. So our long-distance signaling is controlled by hormones. Okay? Hormones are chemical messengers. Okay? They're secreted by a cell. The example we have here, we've got our endocrine cell. Remember your endocrine cell, your endocrine glands were your hormone-secreting glands, like your adrenal gland and pituitary gland and thyroid gland. So these endocrine glands, they're going to secrete the hormones. The hormones are a chemical messenger, and they're going to go work somewhere far away. So they've got to somehow get transported to these target cells. So in animal cells, we're going to use our circulatory system to transport them. That's what you see happening right here. Okay? The endocrine cell releases the hormone. It diffuses into the blood vessel. The blood vessel then will carry it to the target cells. Okay? In plant cells will also use their transport systems. Okay? And also some plant hormones will also diffuse through the air. So they'll use diffusion. For example, the hormone that helps signal with fruit ripening, ethylene, it's a gas. And so that's why when you have one ripe piece of fruit, the other, and it's it's nearby other pieces of fruit, the other pieces of fruit that are not quite as ripe will ripen faster because they're being exposed to this ethylene gas in the air. If your mom or your grandmother, you've ever seen them put a fruit or a vegetable in a paper bag on the counter, that's what they're doing. They may not realize that's what they're doing, but what they're doing is they're trapping that ethylene gas, that hormone, so that it will come in contact with all of the other things that are in, all of the other items that are in that bag. Okay, so plants, their hormones can either travel through their transport system or they can diffuse through the air. So we've got a couple different kinds of hormones we're going to look at. We're going to look at steroid hormones first and how those will work, and then we'll look at protein hormones because those have a much more complex situation. So we're looking at a steroid hormone first. And so a steroid hormone, this is going to be lipid-based. Right? Hopefully we would remember that was a kind of lipid. So steroid hormones are going to be lipid-based. So if we think just for a second about the structure of our cell membrane, okay, our cell membrane itself is made up of mostly phospholipids, right? So this steroid hormone, if it's lipid-based, it's not going to have much of a charge, okay? And so the steroid hormone is able to cross the cell membrane. So the steroid hormone can actually enter into the cell. Your protein-based or your amino-based hormones, they're not able to do that. So your steroid hormones can cross the cell membrane, and their receptor is going to be inside of the cell. So that's a key thing here, okay? So the receptor here is inside the cell. And so the steroid hormone will bind with this receptor, and then that hormone protein receptor will then bind to a target site on the DNA. Okay, so it binds to this target site on the DNA, and it acts as what's called a transcription factor. Oh, I ran out of room there. Let's try that again. There we go. So this hormone protein complex hormone receptor complex acts as a transcription factor. And if y'all hopefully remember from your freshman year, transcription factor is a transcription in general, is taking that DNA and making that messenger RNA copy of it. So when this steroid hormone complex is acting as a transcription factor, it's triggering the formation of some messenger RNA. So basically what's happening is this steroid hormone bound to this receptor protein, okay, that hormone receptor complex can bind to a specific spot on the DNA. It's not going to come bind over here or over here, so it's going to trigger a certain particular gene to be coded for, okay, and so it will cause the messenger RNA to be formed for that particular gene. And then that messenger RNA will come out here and get translated, okay, and it will turn into whatever protein it's coding for. So so your steroid hormones, okay, they can have a direct impact on the DNA. So these are going to control, they can have an impact on gene expression. They can control which genes are being expressed. Okay, your most common examples of steroid hormones, they're going to be testosterone and estrogen, which hopefully you recognize as male and female hormones. Okay, so if you think about this, think about in a multicellular organism, for example, you. Okay, every cell in your body has the exact same DNA. Think about when you watch your crime scene shows. Okay, 95% of the time, the evidence they find at the crime scene is like a hair or skin, but when they take that person into custody, they get their sample from like the inside of their cheek cell. Okay, so now they're comparing the inside of the cheek, so the cheek cells, to this hair cell. Okay, well, if the DNA wasn't the same, there's no way you could make that comparison and say this guy's guilty or not. So the DNA is the same. It's which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off. Which particular parts of the DNA are being used and which parts are not. And so these steroid hormones that can have a direct impact on this DNA, they're going to trigger things that can help with these secondary sex characteristics. Your testosterone, your estrogen, your gender determination. So they can determine those hormones will determine which genes are being expressed, which would determine the formation of those secondary sex characteristics. So these hormones can have a major impact, but the impact of them is also usually relatively slow because they first have to turn the gene on and then they still have to make the proteins, where your amino acid-based hormones will work a little bit faster. Okay, so that's your basics there of how a steroid hormone is going to work. So let's take a look at these amino acid hormones because they've got a lot more stuff going on. Okay, so we're focused now here on these modified amino acids. That's this one right here in the middle. This example here is thyroxine, which is one of the hormones released by the thyroid gland. Okay, it's a modified version of the amino acid tyrosine. Okay, so this is a essentially protein-based, amino acid-based hormone. So it is not going to be able to work like the steroid-based hormone does. It's not going to be able to slip through that cell membrane and work directly on the gene. Okay, so your non-steroid-based hormones, Okay, they have to go through this signal transduction pathway. So they're stuck on the outside of the cell. So your non-steroid hormones have to bind to a receptor on the outside. And when they bind to that receptor, it'll start a pathway inside of the cell. And so that pathway will then cause whatever reaction is going to happen. Okay, and that's going to be a little bit faster than your steroid-based hormones that travel into the cell and trigger gene expression. Okay, so these non-steroid hormones are going to they're going to bind to the receptor on the cell membrane. They'll trigger this. It's called a signal, and we're going to look very closely at this transduction pathway that will trigger a response. Okay, and so like I said, it's going to be a little bit faster than your steroid hormones. So we're going to look at all the different parts of the signal transduction pathway and cell signaling, okay, for our non-steroid hormones. So we're going to first start with the reception part. So the cell signaling is going to have three basic steps. Okay, it's got the reception, the transduction, and then the actual cellular response. So we're going to focus first on the reception and the different kinds of receptors that there are. And so the reception is just going to be the signal molecule interacting with a receptor that's going to be on the cell membrane. So this receptor is on the plasma membrane. So this, again, this signal is not, this chemical signal, this hormone, is not getting across that cell membrane. Again, because it's a protein-based. And so it most likely will have a charge, or it will be too large, but it's not going to be able to fit across that, it's not going to be able to make it across that cell membrane. And so most of the times this reception is going to cause a change in the receptor shape. Y'all remember a triangle is change? Okay, so we're going to get a change in the receptor shape, or that conformation of the receptor. And that will trigger, usually, the transduction pathway that will happen after that. Okay, these molecules, these signal molecules that are going to bind to these receptors, they are called ligands. Okay, so a ligand is a signal molecule that's going to bind to the site on the target protein. Some examples would definitely be hormones. We looked at that local communication, okay, those neurotransmitters. Those would be examples of ligands. Okay, the ligand, again, a ligand is basically anything, that says hormone, that's a space between those. Okay, so your ligand is basically anything that will bind to the site on the target protein. So again, hormones, neurotransmitters, growth factors, any of those would be ligands. So let's take a look at the different, we've got a couple different kinds of receptors that we need to talk about. Three basic kinds of receptors. So the first receptor we have here is called a GProteinLinked Receptor. Okay, and so we've got, like I said, we've got this GProteinLinked Receptor. And so GProteinLinked receptors, they activate G proteins. So our G protein receptor is going to activate the G protein. Okay, so the G protein receptor is going to be found in the cell membrane. So this purple right here, this would be our G protein receptor. This is where our signal is going to come in. Our ligand is going to come in and bind there. Okay, this is what it looks like, kind of zoomed out there. So this G protein linked receptor is in the plasma membrane, and the ligand will come in and bind to it, and that will activate the receptor. And you'll see the receptor has a portion that interacts with the G protein. So the receptor is not the G protein. The receptor is what will interact with the G protein. And the binding of the ligand triggers that interaction. Okay, let's look at a drawing that kind of shows us that a little bit. Okay, so let's look at what we have here. So what I have my receptor here. Okay, and so here's my signal molecule, or my ligand, coming in. And that ligand is going to bind to that receptor right there. See how it fits? Remember, we like that shape matching stuff? Okay, so the G protein receptor, G protein linked receptor, is activated by the ligand. And that activation of that receptor, okay, is going to trigger the G protein. You'll see the G protein here has a GDP attached to it. This ligand binding to the receptor triggers the replacement of the GDP with GTP. Okay, so I've got this receptor that is activated by the ligand that triggers this GDP to be replaced with the GTP, okay, which now activates